Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. It's so good to see you again. Today, we're talking all about relationships for Monday Mindset, and not just relationships, our mental and emotional boundaries within those, and how do we keep them healthy and secure. But before we do, let's jump into this week's quote. Daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others. And that's by Brené Brown. And this quote was something that rang so true to me and my clients when I shared it with them, because it's really about that journey of self-love, self-worth, and valuing ourselves. And when we do that, we are going to disappoint people along the way, especially if they're used to us being a certain way, or maybe not having boundaries, or when we start to implement those boundaries, it can be a little uncomfortable for others because they're used to us a certain way. However, when it comes to having those healthy relationships and creating those relationships, people that really value us, love us, and respect us are absolutely going to take those in. It might take some time to adjust, but they're going to respect them. Somebody who maybe doesn't respect them, you might want to look at that as an unhealthy relationship. So what are emotional and mental boundaries? Well, it's about protecting your feelings, ideas, perspectives, wishes. When we're able to validate our feelings and understand our perspective of the situation, it can be a lot clearer to set those boundaries based off of our values and what we believe in. And what happens in our relationships is really important to separate our feelings from our partner's feelings, because we're experiencing two different things sometimes. It might be the same situation, but how we're setting the boundary, how our tone is, how we're coming across and communicating it. And when we're able to do that, we're able to have healthier boundaries when we separate our own feelings from one another, because they're both valid. So to have healthy emotional boundaries, it's when you end and your partner begins. So in a situation, somebody might be angry and the other person might be sad. They could be feeling similar things because, both of those kind of resonate, are in the same family of emotions. It's just getting underneath the layers of those emotions. But it's being able to understand, how do we set effective boundaries, especially when emotions are involved, which is really staying calm and dealing with a situation after the situation's happened or before, but having a better game plan the next time so you're more aware of how to navigate a healthier relationship when it comes to your boundaries. So let's talk about boundary violations, because this is where people are like, well, I don't know if I crossed a boundary or what that looks like. So these are just some of the things that could happen. Somebody could be interrogating the other person's memory of events when they remember correctly. So just questioning it, basically saying, well, that's not really true what you're saying, even though it is. So that could be a violation. Identifying your partner's thoughts as imagined or crazy. Well, when you start to question what's going on in your partner's thoughts, or like, well, that's not true, I don't know what you're talking about, that could be a clear indication of an unhealthy relationship as well. Denying promises that were made. Somebody had made a promise and doesn't follow through with it, and that could potentially be a huge boundary violation. Minimizing the other person's feelings as being too sensitive when the reaction was somewhat normal. So kind of going back to the crazy or imagined, it's just like, well, that's not true, or you're making a big deal out of it, you're being too sensitive, when the reality, that is not the case and your boundary's been violated. So what are some of the subtle signs of boundary violations? Because it's like you can see when a boundary's been crossed after the fact, but how do you kind of gauge when it might be happening or has already happened a little bit too quick? Shame. Shame's a big one. So for instance, having a night to yourself and your partner takes care of the kids. You're like, okay, I don't have to work on my business today. I get that day off or that night off. And all of a sudden, that person starts to get texts and calls throughout the night, just saying they miss her and they wish she was home. That is definitely a subtle sign of a boundary violation, because you're not allowing your partner to go out and have fun or do what they're like, spending time with their friends or whatever it may be, but being able to have that night off completely after the boundary was already set. So that's a subtle sign. Doubting your decisions. So second guessing after someone's constantly questioning it. It might be about a new designer, for instance, for your new logo or a launch that you're having. And when you do that, people start to weigh in or question what you have, even though you're like, no, this is what I want. And you've already, like, it's structured, the content's great, everything is great around that logo. It all flows together. But those doubts start to come into play because of others. That's a subtle sign. Something's off. Something seems off. The internal bells are going off inside, that gut-wrenching feeling. And it might not be so strong. It might just be that little, like, feeling. You're just like, okay, ignoring it, even though your intuition's telling you somebody's crossed your boundary. Self-blame. It's another form of excuses when someone mistreats you. So common, like, little taglines that might be said is, it's my own fault. Or, if I blank, then blank. So really putting that responsibility onto yourself when that was not necessary. You've already set the boundary and someone decided to violate it. Decision is disregarded. So you've made a decision and it's completely disregarded, giving away your power to that person. Another way that can happen, another sign. Justifying bad behavior. So when you justify bad behavior, you ignore it, or you minimize it, or it's not a big deal. Those things, that is definitely a sign, a subtle sign. So setting emotional boundaries. Well, how do you do that? Well, it really starts with commit to letting go of fixing other people, people-pleasing, taking responsibility of others' choices. When we're able to let that go, that allows us to have a clearer mindset of, okay, this is the boundary that needs to be set. Instead of being like, well, I could fix it, or, oh, I don't mind helping. And that people-pleasing that we talked about a few weeks ago can really take form if we're not careful. So it's really committing to letting go, just being aware of it. Identify where you're lacking emotional boundaries. So the ones we were talking about earlier, just protecting our feelings and our thoughts and our ideas and perspectives. When we're able to identify maybe where we need to be a little bit stronger in those, it makes it easier to set the boundaries. What's blocking you from detaching? So maybe you're so used to taking on other people's feelings that it's hard to detach because you want to help them, you care about them. However, it goes back to respecting ourselves, or respecting our feelings, because they're just as valid as someone else's. Time to break down the barriers. Do you have brick walls up around you? Well, that's going to be really hard to set emotional boundaries or let somebody in a trusting manner. And time and space, of course, makes it grow and break down those barriers. But when we have barriers up, it's really hard to even have those boundaries because they're just brick walls. They're not allowing people in and out when it's necessary and when you feel safe to do so emotionally. Find what grounds you to maintain boundaries. So a big thing about this is journaling, writing it down, getting it out of your head too, because sometimes we can work things up in our head. But when we're able to really understand, okay, what makes me calmer before I set a boundary? Maybe it's meditating. Maybe, like I said, journaling or doing something or practicing in front of the mirror. Those are just 3 examples. And then self-love and self-care. How are you nurturing yourself? How are you allowing yourself to regroup and emotionally be aware of what you need and what you will not tolerate? So where do you start, right? Find a calm moment. Deal with the emotion. Define the boundary that's been crossed, and then have the conversation. So when you're upset with your partner in your relationship, it's being able to take a step back. I do this a lot, and thankfully my partner is amazing about listening to me. But I have to deal with my emotions first. I have to understand, why am I upset? What's going on? It might have nothing to do with him, but being able to really, and usually it's not, but being able to deal with that emotion, identify it, and then have the conversation that you think's been crossed. So it goes back to communication, being able to communicate, this is what my emotion is, and this is what I feel went wrong, and how can we fix this moving forward? How can we be more aware, which is my next point of being assertive and direct. When we're aware of what's going on, we can be very direct and clear of why this is bothering me. And when we're able to do that, it's being able to approach it in a very loving place. Because if you're already calm, it's going to be a little bit easier to address it versus if you're angry and frustrated, that can really be damaging to the relationship, but also to what you're trying to say too. It will not block it. You'll allow it to flow when it's coming from a good place. And reciprocate, model the behavior you want to see in your partner. So if you're not communicating, how do you expect your partner to communicate? It's a two-way street. And I think it's really important to be able to understand, okay, if I am saying this, I'm sharing my feelings, they're going to reciprocate that because they're seeing you put in that effort and they're going to meet you halfway. Or, it's a 50-50. So my last question is, do you have healthy boundaries in your relationship? Do you have the respect? Do you own your own feelings? Do you take responsibility for them, no matter what they are? Because they're your feelings. And like I said, they are valid. I probably said it 20 times, but it's okay because that's a really important factor. Identify outside your relationship. Like, identify what you like to do, the identity of who you are outside of that relationship. Because that's one thing I did before I started dating again, of really being able to know, okay, well, who am I? Who is Caroline? And that's what I ask you, like, who are you? Who are you outside of your relationship? What do you like to do? What are your hobbies? What lights you up? Time alone. Having that downtime is really important in a relationship. So what do you do by yourself outside of your relationship? Same concept, identifying it and your identity, but being able to understand that it's important to have that alone time as well. When uncomfortability happens in conversations, it's really eye-opening when we're able to talk through that and know that they're not going to leave because we told them how we feel. And I think that's a really pivotal part in a relationship, when we're able to push through that uncomfortability or the discomfort of a conversation we might not want to have, especially if you're a former people pleaser or working through that. It can be really challenging to say what you want because you're not sure how the response is going to be because you haven't rocked the boat before. And vulnerable with one another. When you're just truly honest with yourself and others, it can make such a difference, especially in our relationships. That's the foundation of a relationship outside of communication, just being vulnerable, because I feel like vulnerability is a huge element of communication. So I hope that was helpful. Make sure to like, subscribe, comment below. Thank you for joining, and I'll see you on the next video.